Whenever.
Okay, today is follow-up interview from case 008, 2015. This is at the Bundy Museum with Janna. What's your last name, Janna?
Janna Butler.
Hi, Janna. Thanks for talking with us.
Oh, sure.
Okay. So I have some questions, and we'll just have a conversation. Right. So we're in. It's now the museum, but once it was a home.
Yes.
When was this built?
This house was built in 1892. It was built for Harlow Bundy and his family. The architect was Alfred Bartu. He was 27 years old when he designed this house. And cost them $64,000 to build it.
Which was a lot of money.
Yeah, at the time.
What style is this house?
This is a Queen Anne style Victorian house.
Oh, it's lovely. Okay. Can you tell me about the heating?
Right now we have a furnace with forced hot air. It's been forced hot air heat for a while. You can tell the heating grates are old. At one time the house had steam heat in radiators and had a big octopus furnace in the basement. It was coal fired. There's a coal room downstairs and a coal chute for the coal deliveries. The fireplaces also were coal burning at the time. A couple of them have been converted to gas and were probably used in the early to mid 20th century that way.
Could you tell me when the last fire was in one of these fireplaces?
I really have no idea, but I'm guessing that it was before 1965.
Okay.
1965 onward, this house was a business. I don't really think that they would have had any desire or need to use the fireplaces.
Okay, that's great. How about the wiring?
Oh gosh, the wiring is original in this house. We've had small repairs at the lighting fixtures, but as far as the wiring that's in the walls, it's original.
It's original.
Mhm.
Okay. Do you have any reports on the attic upstairs? There's the roundish part.
Mm-hmm.
Any idea what that was used for? Any reports?
Well, we don't have any actual evidence of what that was used for. We know that that room was finished. So they had taken care to make it look nice. It could have served entertainment purposes, could have been a music room. It's really hard to say. We have evidence that Julia Bundy used the third floor for card parties because she had 40 or 50 guests at these card parties and they would not have fit anywhere else in the house.
That's true.
So that room probably served sort of an entertainment purpose for them.
Okay. Do you know if any of them were involved in the spiritualist community? Any seances and, talking with other folks?
I don't think that they were. The Bundy family were, I believe they were Presbyterian, something like that. They were active as far as being members of a church here locally. And we don't have any evidence that they were into the spiritualism movement.
Okay, super. Okay. So tell me about the surrounding houses.
Okay, well, the house on one side now houses our offices. It's called the Lacey House. It was built by a man named Lacey, I guess. I don't know a whole lot about that house except that it's got a pretty interesting history as far as having been a private hospital at one time. And I'm sorry, I think that's my phone. I'm terribly sorry. I silenced it, but I didn't turn off the
That's all right.
vibrator. Anyway, so it was the house next door is the Lacey House. I don't know exactly what year it was built, but it was around the same time as the Bundy house. All three of these houses are within 5 or 6 years of each other.
So the mid 19.
Yeah, from the late 1880s to the 1890s.
1890s.
Somewhere in
Okay.
there. Yeah. I don't think they were built past 1900.
Okay. So it's the Lacey house,
Mhm.
the Bundy house.
Yes, and the Connolly house. Now the Connolly house has always been a two-family house from what I understand. The census has always shown two families living in it with the address being 131 and 131 and a half. The Hopton family lived in the Connolly house before they moved into the Bundy house in 1912. They had lived there for a good many years as neighbors to the Bundys.
Very nice. So in the surrounding areas, the blue house across the street.
I don't really know much about that house. It's contemporaneous with the Bundy house. The architecture suggests 1890s.
Okay. Nothing really we know for sure about surrounding.
No, I do know there was a boarding house across the street. It may be the house just to the east of the blue house. The only reason I know that is because the Hoptons had a burglary, and the burglar was living in a boarding house across the street. We know that from the newspaper account.
So let's talk about who lived in the house.
Mhm.
So the first family was the Bundys.
Yeah. So the Bundys moved in late 1892, possibly January 1893. Same time that Bruce Bundy was born, incidentally. So Julia was great with child when they were building this house, and then Bruce was born just as they were moving in, or shortly thereafter.
Who were all the children?
The children were Helen. She was 7 when they moved into this house. Bruce was born in 1893 in January, and Margaret was born in 1895. Yep.
And so it was Julia and Harlow and the 3 kids.
And Helen, Bruce, and Margaret, yes. And Julia, by the way, went by Luli. So I call her Julia because that was her given name, but she actually, from the time she was a child, she was called Luli, and everybody called her that.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Who were the second people that moved in?
The Packard family moved in 1910 or
They were next door.
1909. Well, no, this is in between those 2 families. This is kind of new stuff that we just learned through our research. So in 1909 or 1910, the Packards moved in. Joe Packard was a gentleman farmer from Oxford, New York, and he had been married twice before, widowed at least once, and he had grown children. He married Jane, what was her name? Oh, goodness, her name was Jane. He married Jane.
He married
From
Jane.
Portland.
Jane from Portland.
Jane from Portland was a spinster. She was brought up in the church. She was raised by her aunt and uncle, who had no other children. She was the church organist. She taught Sunday school. At the age of 52, she was married for the first time to Mr. Packard.
Good for her.
Yes. So she moved in here with him and his grown children. A year later, they were Splitsville. They split up. Mr. Packard went back to the farm in Oxford, where he lived out his days with his oldest daughter. And Mrs. Packard traveled the world.
Wow.
Yeah, just for fun.
Do we know any of the names of the children?
Oh, not off the top of my head. I don't know the names of the Packard children. Because they only lived here for a year, I focused on the couple
Sure.
and on their relationship.
Which
trying
was
to figure
very
out what
tumultuous there.
Yes, and
Case
they...
for freedom at 52 and like, right.
That's right. And they both referred to themselves as widows in the census thereafter, which made our research really confusing at first. So initially we had thought one of them had passed away, and oh, how sad, they're newlyweds and everything. They were both very much living, calling themselves widows. So I think it has to do with divorce and how it was viewed at the time.
Sure.
And Mrs. Packard, having been brought up in the church, she really was uncomfortable with that term.
Yeah.
You know, so she called herself widowed, and she lived with a lady friend in Brooklyn for most of the rest of her life, and she traveled from there. She passed away in California in the 1940s.
Speculation.
Yeah.
So then who was after the Packards?
The Hopton family moved in. E.F. Hopton, gosh, I can't remember his name, Alfred Hopton, I believe, something like that. He was a candy maker. He had a caramel factory in Johnson City.
That was great caramels, by the way.
Yes, yeah.
World known.
Yes, they were. And that factory was making candy until the 1980s, I believe.
It was, and I got candy from there.
Really?
I used to get caramel marshmallows. It was wonderful.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, and his factory actually was featured in the paper many times for how safe it was, and they had a great safety record, and plus the good stuff that they made. But so E.F. Hopton made his fortune that way. For a good many years, he and his family had lived next door in the Connolly house as neighbors to the Bundys. The Bundys moved on in 1906. The Packards were here, 1910, just into 1911. And then in 1912, the Hoptons moved in.
Okay.
And they made this their home. They did some redecorating, maybe some repainting. They had the paintings made that are hanging in the stairwell. And they lived out the rest of their days here. They raised 2 daughters, Alice and Jessie. Alice was married in the parlor of the house in 1917. By all accounts, from what I can tell, they were very happy here, and they loved the house. The children, though, goodness, by the time their parents had passed away, the girls really didn't want anything to do with this house. One of them lived in New York City. She was married to a lawyer, and she was doing just fine. The other was living over on Holly Street, where she had lived since she was a newlywed. They had no interest in the house. The house was divided out. We've heard accounts of people renting rooms in here during the World War II years, so it was a rooming house.
Okay.
The boarders were very respectful. They didn't trash the place.
They didn't trash the place, which is
At all.
amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. I mean, considering that kind of history, the house remained intact. Mr. Hopton, backing up a little bit, Mr. Hopton passed away in 1931 in the house. Mrs. Hopton passed away in 1942. And as far as I can tell, she was living here by herself when she died. And then the house, the history is a little bit murky. From 1942 to 1965, it's hard to say who lived here, how many people were in and out of this place. But in 1965, Dwayne and Dorothy Hall bought the house, and they turned it into Fairview Press.
Okay.
So they had their business here. They didn't live here, but they spent most of their waking hours here. Their children spent most of their waking hours here. They raised a family here, basically. And they experienced, life, at least from the business side, in this house. And they loved the place very much. And when they were looking to sell, they had offers that they refused because they didn't feel that the fit was good. They didn't want to sell it to someone who was not going to take good care of the house and preserve it.
There was a love for this house.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And they're still living. They still visit us from time to time. It's great. So.
Oh, that's very nice.
Yeah. So after the Halls, goodness, see, they went to sell the house in 2001, and Michael Weinstein bought it. He bought it because he loves Victorian homes. He'd always wanted to own one. He loves antiques. He sells them. And he envisioned turning this into an antiques gallery. People could walk through. They could buy antiques and enjoy the house at the same time. But really, the market in Binghamton just doesn't support businesses like that. And doing the deed search, which he did himself, he recognized that Bundy name and said, wait, this house has significance, like real historical significance. So he said, this should be a museum. Let's do that instead. So, he maintained the properties on either side as offices, apartments that help sustain the museum. But this house itself, he set about furnishing it. He put about $100,000 into it just to restore what was here. From the original wallpaper in the hallway into the upstairs round room, he had the whole place restored and opened it to the public in 2004.
2004.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're in 2015.
Yeah.
And we've had many visitors since then.
Yes, we have. Thousands each year.
Thousands each year.
Yeah.
And when you look online, this TripAdvisor has some lovely things to say about the
They
Bundy
do.
Museum.
People are very kind, yeah.
So we talked a little bit about the Bundy family that lived here. Was there ever any report of a death, I guess for any of the families that lived here?
The only deaths that I know of that have ever occurred in this house were Mr. Hopton in 1931 and Mrs. Hopton in 1942.
Now, you have a picture of Mr. Hopkins.
Mr. Hopton?
Yes.
Yes, I do.
And you do. And there's been reports of a man in the window.
Right. Oh my goodness.
And could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So it's been about a year ago, I think. I mean, it was fairly recent. Two women saw a figure in the window of our second floor round bedroom. Both times at night, and both sightings were within 24 hours of each other. Neither of the women had mentioned it to each other. One was a tenant on one side of our building in the Connolly house. She was walking down the street in the evening and just happened to look up at the window and saw a man in the window. And she described it as a yellowish pallor to his complexion, almost like an orangish look. She said that he appeared kind of dark-haired and wearing a tall hat and a suit. And she said he was just peering out the window. And it freaked her out enough that she turned around and ran back home to get her boyfriend, who's actually our art director, and to tell him that he's a huge skeptic of any of this stuff. So he told her she's, probably imagining things. Within 24 hours of this, a tenant on the other side, in our office, upstairs from our office, was walking her dog. And she was walking the other direction. So this is sightings from two different directions. And her dog stops to sniff at the end of the fence where all the dogs stop. And he stopped, but then he looked up at the window. And dogs don't look up at windows unless there's a dog in the window. Mm-hmm. So when he looked up, she looked up, and there she saw pretty much the same image that the lady the previous day had seen. She described it to me very much the same way. They came to me separately the next day to tell me about what they had seen, and it just cracked me up because neither of them had talked to each other in the meantime.
We'll put a picture in, but the picture you have of this gentleman is a dark-haired man with dark, and our artist, our intuitive artist Suzanne, drew a picture that's very similar to him.
Yeah. And it wouldn't surprise me. Honestly, it's the picture of Hopton, of Mr. Hopton. He has a dark look to him, dark eyes, dark hair, dark mustache. He's a very serious man, dressed in dark suits.
Mm-hmm.
He was dignified. He was a business owner. I mean, he was a very serious guy.
Prominent in the area.
Yes, he was. And he also loved this house. He lived out his days. He died in this house. I think that he was extremely proud of it. And, if anybody's hanging around, who was connected to this house, I would guess it to be him.
Now, his wife, when did she pass?
1942.
So she was after him?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And do we have any idea what she looked like?
I have no idea what she looked like. That poor woman. She's so poorly represented in anywhere. There are articles in the paper all about her husband and his business and his factory. Her obituary lists her name and her date of birth and her date of death, and then proceeds to talk about her husband and his career.
Which at the time is what was going on. So
Yes.
he died in what year?
1931.
And he died in 1942.
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That helps. That's what that kind of thing. So we know nobody else really. I mean,
Right, not that we know of.
Not
The
that we
Bundys
know.
all, uprooted, moved elsewhere. The Packards uprooted, moved elsewhere, died elsewhere. And as far as the Borders in the World War II years in the 50s and 60s, we just simply don't know
We
who
just
they
don't
were.
know.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the Bundys for a minute, and I want to talk about the staff that worked here.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about their domestic?
Okay, their domestic help, her name was Mary Shea. We just learned about her because she only worked here for a short time. In the 1905 census, she was listed as living in this house, and her occupation was listed as servant. In 1901, there was a fire in the house, in the kitchen. Above the kitchen is her room, or what we think was her room.
Well, we agree with that.
Yeah, and my theory is this: the family couldn't really afford live-in help before that. Harlow's company, right around the year 1900, acquired other companies and took off. I mean, it just their standard of living went way up around 1900. So I really believe that when they were remodeling the house after the fire, they may have thought, it's time, let's add a room for the servant, let's hire someone. And so she showed up in the 1905 census, but not in the one before that. So she came to work here sometime between 1900 and 1905.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't go to Endicott with them when they moved there in 1906. She stayed in Binghamton, I guess. There's really not much record of Mary Shea after that.
Okay. And how about the chauffeur?
Yes. Orrin French. He was also listed in the 1905 census as their coachman. Well, nobody was driving coaches in 1905. That was an antiquated term for a driver. So he was the driver of their motor car. And he was listed in that same census as living here and living on Court Street in a rooming house with his mother and many siblings. So my theory is that when his mother answered the door for the census taker, she said, yes, my son lives here. When Lily or Mary answered the door here for the census taker and was asked about their staff, they said, yes, we have a driver who lives here. He may or may not have lived here full time, but he almost certainly maintained a room here. So in the carriage house on the second floor, there's an adorable little room that would have been a perfect sleeping room for a driver. We think that was his room.
I do too.
Yeah.
That's what he's told me.
Yeah.
Any other staff or people with any of the other families that we know of?
Nope, that's the only census that listed any staff living here at all.
Okay. I want to talk to you about, I've told you the story that since, my teenage years, 40-some years ago, I used to see a little girl in the two windows upstairs, the round bedroom and the master bedroom, and couldn't get her to pass on. During our investigation, we had some encounters with her. Do you have any reports or anything of that nature of a little girl?
Not in this house. In this house, I've only experienced very specific things, and none of them had to do with children at all that I know of. In our office next door in the Lacey house, I heard distressing children's screams. One time on a Saturday morning when I was by myself, and the dog upstairs heard it too. At the same time, I heard his toenails crossing the floor as he was investigating the same sound I was hearing. And when I stepped outside to see if maybe there was a screaming child around the building, it was dead silent outside. There was no... I came back in the house and the sound had stopped. But it was a scream that increased in volume, and it was I've never heard anything like it. Yeah. And it was definitely a child. It was a girl child, maybe 3 years old. That I could tell that much from the screams.
Oh, very interesting. We got some screams here, you got a scream over there.
Mm-hmm.
Very interesting. We talked about the man in the window. Did any of the people have lived here? Well, it might be, maybe they recorded it. They ever say it was just a home, or they ever said, this is kind of weird?
Any of the, I'm sorry.
Any of the families, like when the people with the Fairview Press had it, or did anyone ever say, hey, weird things go on here?
No, and that's, I've always meant to ask Mrs. Hall, because she's a cool lady. I think she would tell me, if I asked. I just have never thought to ask her when she's here. She told me that she was robbed once here. I mean, she has talked about things that happened, but nothing of the supernatural or spiritual nature.
Okay.
So I don't know. Her son comes around from time to time, and it's just, I've never thought to ask, But nobody's ever mentioned it.
Never, yeah. We talked about major events around the building and the grounds. Now, the annex was added onto the coach house at what time?
Mm-hmm. The modern parts of the carriage house were added on in the 1980s by the Halls as part of their business.
Okay. And we talked about a fire in the kitchen,
Mm-hmm.
but we don't know of any other fire?
No, we don't have any evidence of any other fire or anything, because the house is very original and intact.
Right.
The kitchen's the only part of the house that's ever been renovated or changed in any significant way. The report of the fire was in the newspaper, and it was a very short little blurb, and all it said was there was a fire at the Bundy residence, and it said the address. It's my guess that it was a kitchen fire because of the room having been changed.
Changed and added upstairs.
Yeah.
And is that maybe when they changed the porch room into the telephone room, so to
Well,
speak?
I don't know. I think that room was enclosed in the 20th century later.
Okay.
It may have been part of Fairview Press. Actually, that's my guess. The door on it's very modern. I think that the Halls probably had that room enclosed. It was an open porch at one time. A carriage porch, visitors coming in. So, but I think it was enclosed later, much later.
So we know that the original to the house, as much as we can say, is the lovely woodwork.
Yes.
The fireplace mantle is just incredible. The wallpaper outside or on the walls in the foyer.
Yeah, that wallpaper's original, and there's a little bit of original wallpaper in the back hall between the kitchen and the back sitting room.
Okay.
That wallpaper you can see on a photograph that we have used to cover the rooms of the back, or the walls of the back sitting room too.
Okay.
But it doesn't anymore. It's just a little bit.
And the lovely large paintings, portraits.
Yeah, those big paintings in the stairwell, they're from 1912, so they date from the Hopton occupation of the house.
Mm-hmm. Do you know if there's been any connection to the Binghamton Fire of 1913?
I don't know of any connection. No, and that occurred during the years that the Hoptons were living here.
And there was an infirmary next door.
Yes.
Okay, that helps. So tell me about your experiences in the house.
Oh wow. Okay, so I've had several experiences of hearing things in this house. Mostly footsteps. My very first day working at this museum, my coworker and I came over and sat in the library to have a talk, and it was quiet, and where it was quiet, because it's quiet over here, we unlocked the door, disarmed the alarm, and sat down to talk. So we were the only ones in this house. As we talked, I heard footsteps upstairs, in the hallway upstairs. Heavy boot, ka-thump, 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 ka-thump.
We have that.
And she and I, as we were talking, she kind of would roll her eyes, and And the footsteps eventually stopped, and then she just looked at me and said, "Did you hear those footsteps upstairs?" And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Nobody's upstairs." And I said, "I assumed that there were people upstairs." And she said, "Well, no, because we're the only ones here. We disarmed the alarm when we came in." She said, "Sometimes we hear those." And she said, "We don't know what they are, but sometimes we hear them." And that's pretty much all she said at that time. I heard them again some months later when I was shutting down for the day. I was hitting the lights on the ground floor. I was the only one working that day. It was a Saturday, but it was a slow day. I came in here and hit the lights in this dining room, and the footsteps started upstairs. And from where we sit, the footsteps would run towards the stairs, not run, but walk towards the stairs. And I thought, if I walk out of this room, in theory, I'll be able to look up and see the source of the sound. And that just really freaked me out. So I just hit the lights as fast as I could. I cut through the library, hit the lights there, but they were just pacing back and forth and back. And I took off out of here, and I went next door. I called my daughter. Actually, I was shaking like this. I said, "Oh, I heard the ghost in the house." But so that's the kind of sound. But it's not a sound that can really be mistaken for anything else.
That's true.
You know,
we caught that on sound.
It wasn't a squirrel. You know, it was boots.
It's heavy boots.
Yeah.
We've caught a sound clip of that.
Yeah. Now, and from something that we've noticed over the years of having heard these sounds, I've heard them, Rhonda has heard them, who used to work here, and I think maybe Megan heard them too. She used to work here as well. We noticed that when a dark-haired woman enters the house for the first time, oftentimes that'll stir up the footsteps. That's why we, kind of think of them as curious type of footsteps. They're curious about who's here. Rhonda brought in a group of young ladies who were doing a photo shoot in the parlor, and at least one of them had long dark hair. And she told me later that those footsteps started up the second they came in and began to set up in the parlor. And she didn't say anything to those girls because she didn't want to freak them out, but she heard it. And that seems to have been sort of a trigger for the. It doesn't happen every time. I've brought dark-haired ladies. I mean, we give tours all the time, and I've never heard the footsteps when I'm giving a tour, and that kind of disappoints me a little bit on one hand, because we get asked all the time if there are hauntings in this house, and I always say, "Oh yeah, we hear things." The only other thing that I've ever heard in this house is rustling, and I love it because Rhonda had told me that she had heard rustling skirts or fabric upstairs. And I didn't really know what she was talking about. But very recently, maybe 3 weeks ago, I was in here by myself, and I was turning on lights, and I was heading up the stairs, and I heard somebody in the back hallway that leads back to the servants' quarters. And it was just a racket. The racket of somebody moving around, moving things around, not alarmingly loud, but loud enough to get my attention. And I thought for sure it must be Eric. He must be doing something in the art gallery. I don't know. So I continued hitting lights, but it was a little bit weird because the sound, it's hard to describe. The sound wasn't as real as it should be if it was an actual physical person. And as I went down the hall, the sound just evaporated. It kind of retreated down the hall as I came around the corner, but then once I was in the hall, the sound just sort of evaporated around me. It was like it just stopped, but not abruptly, it just evaporated. So I walked back into the servants' room where the sounds had seemingly gone, and there was nobody, but the curtain in the room was moving, the curtain to the window. And so I went over and pulled it aside, and the window was closed. So I left that alone and went up to the art gallery just to make sure that there was nobody there. And nobody can sneak around this house. No, the back stairs are really creaky. So if anybody had been there, I would have heard them retreat down the back stairs, no doubt about it. So it was just interesting. And I went outside and immediately found Eric in the annex and said, "Were you upstairs?" And he said, "No, I haven't been in the house today." And I said, "Okay." And he's our biggest, cynic. He's like, "Yeah, right." But it was a real racket of movement. And that was my most recent, experience in the house anyway.
Any other staff members have experiences?
Yeah, some of the ladies who've worked here in the past, Rhonda has heard the footsteps and the rustling skirts. I'm pretty sure Megan has. She mentioned things, but it's been a long time ago. 2011 was the last time I talked to her, so it's been a while. And our recent staff members, Olivia and our art director, Eric, they claim to have never heard anything. And Olivia's a little disappointed by this, actually, because she's kind of envious, I think, when we hear something and tell her, and she's like, I never hear anything. So they haven't heard anything, but hopefully someday they will.
They will. Has any of the visitors ever sent you anything or spoken of anything?
We've had a couple of visitors who say that they have sensed things in this house. We had one young lady who was really, she was pretty disturbed by our African art downstairs. She sensed spirits holding on to her as she walked through there, and she felt that they needed some liberation. And so she called me aside and said, "You need to do something about the spirits in your African exhibit because they're wanting to be set free," or something like that. So, we've had people mention things like that. Our cleaning staff, yes. Heather cleans the museum for us, and she's also a tenant next door. It's her dog that saw the figure in the windows and that led her to see it. But she has experienced a lot of things in this house, and they're of a more personal nature. She's heard her voice whispered in her ear in this house. She's gotten a cold shoulder in the library, felt a real cold presence. She experiences emotions when she's in this house that she feels are brought on by spirits. So she's experienced quite a bit in this house, really, and it's of a much more personal nature, I think.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah.
So speaking of the African art downstairs, it's beautiful. Do we know anything about it?
Not a whole lot. We know countries of origin. We know that it's mostly 20th century, made by skilled craftsmen for the most part. There are a few pieces in the collection that were made for tourists, that were made to be sold to Western collectors. It's usually pretty easy to pick out those objects. I mean, they appeal to the Western eye. They're made of a more soft wood. It's a little easier to work. The traditional objects have missing elements because the people who made them meant for them to be highly adorned. So with either beads or feathers or just grasses, things like that. And they would strip those off before they sold them for the art market. So, we know some about the objects, but not nearly enough. As far as the spiritual meanings, we know that they're imbued with spiritual meanings by the people who made them and used them. And then they would make every attempt to strip the object of all that meaning before they got rid of it, because once it's served its ceremonial purpose for them, then its job is done.
Yeah.
And it can be sold off, because they know these things are saleable.
Right.
So that's what happens.
And the whole collection belongs to?
Belongs to Michael Weinstein. He's the current owner of the building, the founder of the museum. He loves African art. He collected a whole ton of it.
Boy, does he have a ton of it.
Yeah, we've got a lot.
We do. So I want to go into the annex and talk about that. We talked a little bit. The annex has been attached when it was attached when the Fairview Press owned. And there's also some of the collection is upstairs.
Yeah.
So our team experienced a lot of unsettling things in the annex. One of the things I've experienced on a number of times, it's from what you've told me, and I'll ask you, someone else has had the same experience in the house next door.
Oh, really? Yeah.
In the bathroom back there, it's like someone's trying to come in, and they're always saying, "Hold on, I'll be out in a minute," and there's no one there.
Oh, man.
And that's happened to me several times, and during our investigation it happened. Not to me, two of us. It happened to me, but another two of us.
Really?
Now, I understand someone else has had an experience with doorknobs.
Yeah. So Laura, the same lady who saw the figure in the upstairs window the first time, so not the lady with the dog, the other. One of our tenants, former tenants in the Connolly building, experienced that same thing. She was in her bathroom in the apartment, and the doorknob was turning, and she said, "Just a minute, I'll be right out." And she thought it was her boyfriend, and she got out and said, "What the heck's your problem?" He was asleep. He wasn't even near the bathroom when she came out. And so, and that freaked her out. pretty much. And this is a girl who, she's a pretty practical person. You know, she doesn't go around making stuff up. But she, you know, told me about that because she, when she saw the figure in the window, that alarmed her sufficiently to come to me and say, I think you need to know what I saw in the window of the museum. And by the way, you know, there was something trying to get into the bathroom when I was in there too. So,
has anyone else ever said anything about the annex?
yeah, the annex is, you know, I tend to forget about the annex because it's noisy back there. There's clocks clicking and there's clocks being repaired. We have the barber pole that makes noise when it's on. But we were having a board meeting back there, a bunch of us, and we were having a discussion about something. And there were a series of thumps up above our head where the African artist stored, and we all just stopped. And a few of us looked at each other because we had heard of such things before happening back there. But it brought us all to a halt. I mean, it was sufficiently loud. But we also didn't investigate it because we kind of knew that there was really nothing to be seen. It was just that sound. But something I've had happen twice in the annex that was really fun and weird was one of the clock bells would ring. And I know exactly what clock it was because all those clocks back there, for one thing, they're not chiming clocks. So those clocks will never ring by themselves. They're not made to do that. They ring when you clock in. So if you push down on a lever and you have to push really hard, it'll ding. Or you turn a key and it'll ding. Or you press a stylus and it'll ding, depending on the clock. And each clock has a different sounding bell in it. So, you know, they're all a little different. And on 2 occasions, I've heard the bell on one of those clocks ding. And it happens to be one of the clocks that's not running right now. Not that even makes a difference. It wouldn't ding anyway. But it's one of the clocks nearest the door. And I was in a yoga class in our annex, and it was very quiet in there. We had the lights down. We were performing our poses, and I heard ding. I thought, there's nobody in there. And it was just clear as a bell, you know, I heard it. And at the end of class, we heard it again. And I say we because I went over to the instructor and I said, did you hear a bell during your class? She said, yeah, I heard the clocks dinging. And I said, they don't just ding by themselves. And I went in the room and looked around and I dinged it myself, and sure enough, that was the one that I heard. But those clocks they just don't ding by themselves.
Have you ever heard the piano being played?
I never have. No, I've never had any experiences with that piano.
You've had one with the organ in the music room in here.
Yes, that's right. One of our pump organs in here emitted a tone once by itself for no apparent reason. Yeah, and it was a very deep, you know, moaning tone, you know, as if somebody were pressing their hand on a couple of keys at once. But again, these are not organs that can simply be played. They won't make any sound whatsoever unless you're actively pumping the bellows.
Right, you've got to make it go.
And it takes quite a bit of effort to make them make any noise at all.
Yeah, you had a strong foot to do that.
Yeah.
Speaking of the clocks, and there are 77 million clocks in here.
Yeah.
And most of them, or almost all of them, are not electric.
Right, they're wind-up clocks. They operate without electricity.
And some play well with others and some don't.
Yeah. So we've got a couple of clocks that they were just fine when I had them next door in my office, and we had them running for a while, you know, in other places in the museum, and then decided to move them into the house. And the first one I moved in is the one by the door, and it's a reliable, good, you know, clock. Wound it up, and it ran good for a few days, and then it just stopped. And so I re-leveled it and made sure everything was square, but I can't get it to run anymore. And there's no, you know, I can troubleshoot these clocks to a certain extent, and I would listen to it and watch it for a while, and it would run fine. Then I would leave, and it would run for actually hours and hours and hours, but then it would just stop again. And at least 2 occasions, it stopped 10 minutes before I walked into the building. So I would get it going and go about my business and come back and look at my watch and, oh, it just stopped 10 minutes ago, so it ran that long. Get it back going, go home, come in the next day, come over and turn on the lights of the museum and look at it, and it stopped 10 minutes before I walked in the door today as well. So that's that clock. We have one of our Willard Bundy clocks. We don't have very many of those. We have none on display except for the one that's in the house. And that one also, beautiful running condition. I had it running in the annex for a while before I moved it into the house. I set it on a table, leveled it, got it running. It ran for a couple days and then just refused to run anymore. And I can get it running. I can stand and look at it for as long as I want, and it'll run just fine. No trips, no problems. And then I walk away and I come back later and it has stopped.
Now, there was tension between Willard and Harlow Bundy.
Yeah, definitely. That particular clock is from the Willard's company. And Willard Bundy was the inventor. He was the older of the two brothers. In about 1900, 1901, he split from the company. He was fired by his younger brother, Harlow. So Harlow sent him away. He went to Syracuse, started his own clock company. And the two proceeded to sue each other back and forth, until Harlow passed away in 1907. But we've got one of his clocks in the collection, and I thought it would be a hoot to have it in the house. Partially because we're very proud of Willard and
Right.
his accomplishments, and plus he was an all-around nice guy, from what we can tell. And we just thought it would, poke Harlow on the side just a little bit to have his clock in the house.
Well, it makes our machines go off high readings for
Really?
it.
Wow.
We don't know why, but it does. So it's interesting that that's the only piece of equipment from Willard in Harlow's house,
Yeah.
and it doesn't want to play.
Mhm.
So, what is your take on what's going on in this beautiful house?
Well, my take of what's going on in this house is that we've got spirits that are concerned about people entering this house. They're not necessarily mad about it, but they're curious about it. From what I can tell, coming in the front door, oftentimes, not oftentimes, but sometimes triggers footsteps. It seems to me that the footsteps are from someone who's curious about who's come into the house. The rustling skirts, I don't know about that. That did not seem like a curious type of activity to me. It seemed like a busy activity. But I don't get a bad feeling in this house. I don't get a bad
beautiful
feeling.
vibe in here.
Yeah, it seems to me, and like I said, I like to think that it's Edwin Hopton is so proud of his house and just wanting to know who the heck is here now, because this is my house. It's a very different feel than I get, say, next door in the Lacey. To me, there's a distressing something going on over there. And then the annex, I don't know quite what to make of it. It's almost like mischief to me. Some former staff members have talked about girls' laughter, little girl laughter back in the annex, hearing that. So I almost feel like there's a mischief thing going on. That the dinging of that clock, that's not meant to scare a person, and it's also not a curious thing. That's just a funny thing. And I can't help but think that that's more of a playful spirit going on back there.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
So if people wanted to come to visit the Bundy Museum, where are you located and what are your hours?
Oh, we're located on Main Street in Binghamton, 129 Main Street. We're open Tuesday through Saturday, 11 to 5, closed Sunday and Mondays.
It's Binghamton, New York.
Binghamton, New York, that's right. Everyone knows where Binghamton is. It's
I know.
right between New York City and Rochester.
That's right, and there's no P in Binghamton. Right?
That's right, we're
There's
not the northernmost Hampton.
That's right. That's right. So we've had some very interesting experiences here, and we're going to share some of our EVPs with this tape. So we thank you so much for coming and talking with us and letting inspectors come in and do a wonderful investigation. We look forward to coming and playing again because we had a really great time. I have another question.
Yeah.
Has anyone ever talked about the tablecloth moving in here?
I've never noticed the tablecloth moving in here. Nobody's ever mentioned it.
Okay. All right. So thank you. And this is the Bundy House. And this is Jenna and Alani. And thanks so much. Thank you.
I'm sorry my phone kept going.